All right, good afternoon, everyone. We actually have we have Zoom participants and not actually in-person participants. So we're gonna shift gears a little bit and just do a Zoom presentation for you all. And Emily and I will kind of switch places being in front of the camera here. So we have we had time planned for the presentation and then time for questions. It may not be that we're here for a full hour and a half, but we wanted to add a buffer of time if there were a lot of questions. But thank you for coming to the presentation, and we're going to be talking about interview with confidence. So I will have, each of us will introduce ourselves, but this presentation is co-sponsored between Career Services and the Center for Equal Access. And I will have Emily come up and introduce herself, my co-presenter. And let me put this in slideshow mode. So hopefully everyone can see the screen that I'm sharing as well.
Okay. All right. Hey, everyone. My name's Emily Norenberg. It's nice to meet all of you virtually. I think I can enter, right?
Yes.
And just, yay, there I am. Hey. So right now I work as a disability and accessibility consultant at US Bank. And so that work is really captured by thinking about all the behind the scenes work that needs to happen to make a company have the infrastructure it needs to support employees with disabilities. So examples of that would be coordinating particular service providers. So we have a contract, for example, with an American Sign Language interpreting agency. So when an employee raises the flag to indicate that they would need that type of accommodation, we have a quick and easy pathway that we can move towards implementation. So I did a lot of behind the scenes work for about the last year and a half. And then most recently, my work has expanded. So I also provide management and oversight to the employee accommodation request and fulfillment team. So it's kind of a both and of direct provision of disability related accommodations and accessibility infrastructure work to ensure that our company is increasingly more inclusive. And interestingly enough, prior to going to US Bank, I worked at the University of Minnesota Duluth. I was the director for disability resources there. So I've had a foot in both worlds in terms of what does accommodation and access look like on the collegiate kind of post-secondary side of the house, and what does it look like on the employment side of the house. So I'm looking forward to this conversation today to bring those two components together. All right, I'm going to pass it over to Kate again.
All right. And so just a little introduction of myself. My name is Kate Nelson Deshaw. I have my master's degree in counseling, and I'm the career counselor here at CSS in the Career Services office. I have worked in higher education for a little over 10 years and have been in career services for most of that time. So I'm bringing kind of my perspective and skills and experience of interview preparation that we do with students all the time to this presentation, I'll be kind of covering the interview basics and interview prep skills. And we're grateful to have Emily's expertise here for the accessibility part. And I have a lot to learn from her through this presentation as well. And then I will introduce Hannah to talk about CEA.
Hello, my name is Hannah Bober. I'm the Assistant Director with the Center for Equal Access. And the Center for Equal Access is an office on campus that exists to foster an inclusive environment for students with disabilities, with a focus on furthering education and understanding and promoting of students with disabilities. All right, I'm going to turn it back over to Kate.
And so we just wanted to make sure that everyone knew about both of our departments and what we do and how to access us. And so I'll give a little bit of an overview of career services. We are located in Tower 1130, which I realize I don't have on the slide there, but most students contact us through resumes at css.edu, which is an email that students can send resumes, cover letters, personal statements if you're working on grad school application. Maybe you want some advice on your LinkedIn or Handshake accounts and how to use them. You can contact that email address and work via email to get feedback on those things. careers@cdss.edu is just our general email inbox, so always a good way to contact us with any general questions. Mary Anderson, who's the director of career services, and myself are the ones that typically meet with students on some of those services you see on the bottom of the screen. We meet a lot with students on major and career exploration. So for students trying to determine what their major will be, what will be the best fit, we work with them through career assessments, career counseling, conversations, do research. Same thing with career exploration once students are set in their major. Interview preparation, like we'll talk about today, is a big topic that students want help with. And then our internship coordinator, Brianne Tepler, is really the best person to talk to if you're interested in an internship, and how to go about planning for that, preparing for that, finding internship openings, and applying, going through that application process. And then probably the primary way that students will make appointments with career services is through Handshake, and all students have access to Handshake through the Brightspace modules that career services has, and all students have access to that Brightspace page, which you can find on your MyCSS. All right, so the learning objectives that we've set for the presentation today, the first one is that participants will become more familiar with the hiring and interview process. Participants will learn how to prepare for a professional interview. And then participants will gain a stronger understanding of their rights during the hiring process as well. All right, so the first thing I'm gonna spend the first part here just talking about kind of interview basics, prep for interviews, purpose of interviews, things to consider when preparing and practicing for an upcoming interview. And so I like to always pose the question of what is the purpose of a job interview, and just see what feedback folks have. So if you could type it in the chat, or you can say it, what you think some of the purposes of a job interview are. Showcase skills. Yep. I also want to make sure I do this before I forget. But we were going to record this presentation, and I always forget to start that. So I'm going to start the recording now. Oh, I did. Okay. Did you start the recording?
I know.
Thank you.
Sure. Okay, Hannah.
Sorry, we're gonna have a little pause. We have a couple of Zoom members in the room, so there we go. Yes. I'm going to do a quick pause for a second so I can kind of check in on our room here. All right, we're back. We had a person join us in the room, and so I wanted to make sure everything was all on the, everyone was all getting what they needed to see. So we're talking about the purpose of a job of interviews, and I say job interview, but really, I want, like, there's a lot of different types of interviews. There's interviews for paid work experiences, internship interviews, which are similar because it's also a paid work experience, but a little bit different. And then of course we do interviews for grad programs often. So there's a lot of different types of interviews. And in the chat, we had, see if you and the company are a good fit. That's a very good feedback for that question. Showcase skills, get a feel for people you might be working with. Yes, this is perfect. These are all reasons that I make sure people understand, because going into an interview often feels like a one-sided experience where you're on trial and people are asking you questions and it's just a lot of pressure. But really, it's a two-way street with an interview. They're trying to determine if you're a fit, and you're also trying to determine if you're a fit too. So really, I think you should go into an interview with the feeling that you're also interviewing them. And they should be showcasing themselves as an employer you want to work for, and determining what kinds of things that are being offered at the company and with the position that are best fit for you and your satisfaction on the job. Okay, let's see if this works now. So when thinking about preparing for an interview, there's these items that I like to make sure people keep in mind. Like I said, it is not a one-way street. You are there being an active interviewer as much as they are interviewing you. So you want to think of the experience as a conversation and not being on trial, where there's several people just interrogating you the whole time you're there. It's important to make sure that you're being authentic and genuine, because you want to make sure you're being yourself, so that you don't feel like you're kind of faking it. And then when it comes time to actually start the position, if you get the job, then all of a sudden things are different, right? And so that can be really challenging when you're going through an interview process, because it's really nerve-wracking to be an interviewee. There's a lot of pressure, but relax, breathe. The breathing thing is actually really helpful, especially before you get started, like taking the time to kind of just calm yourself down in the lobby as you're waiting, and remember that you're there to interview them as well. You want to make sure you're being very positive and enthusiastic throughout the interview process. And I talk about being positive in terms of, like, you may be asked negative things or asked to talk about, weaknesses, challenges you've been through. And even in those situations, you want to make sure you're focused on the positive aspects of the experiences and not dwelling on negative and being very negative about people or past employers, especially. And so I've said this before, this is an exchange of information. You're trying to find a good fit both directions, and the employers really want to hear about your successes. So this is the part where when I'm working with students to prepare them for interviewing, oftentimes I get a lot of, I really feel uncomfortable talking about myself for so long, and talking about all the things I've done and the good things, because it feels like I'm bragging. But that's really the whole point of the interview process. That's what the employer wants to learn from you, is what you've done and what you've done well. So, well, it can be challenging to get past that, especially something that's kind of culturally ingrained in us. It's important to remember that's the point of why you're there. That's what they want to hear. All right. So when I tell students about preparing for an interview, I like to kind of focus on these 5 essential components, because I feel like even if you were offered an interview tomorrow and you didn't have a whole lot of time to prepare, if you had these 5 things ready to go and practice them, for maybe a half hour that evening or something, you would feel a ton more confident than just going in cold thinking, okay, I'll wing it and see how it goes. So the first thing is almost, I don't know, I would say, every interview I've ever been in, the very first thing they'll often open with is something like this, an introduction. They want you to introduce yourself. Tell us about yourself. And so when preparing for an interview, you're preparing for questions to be asked of you and how you would answer those questions. And sometimes people forget that in the very beginning, they're going to have to give some introductory information first. And so they might say, tell us about yourself. and you're not expecting that open-ended command. And all of a sudden you're like, I'm Kate, like, and you don't know what to say. So this is kind of equivalent to that elevator pitch. If you've heard of an elevator pitch, when you're introducing yourself to people in a professional situation, a networking situation, the same kind of information can be shared to introduce yourself in the job interview, and have these things prepared ahead of time. Jot down some keywords, some notes for yourself, a little outline. Try not to script it, because if you're scripted, that comes across that way, and overly practiced, and it's not as natural. But have some outlined notes of what you want to include. Max 2 minutes. I've been in some really painful interview situations where the introduction goes on for like 15 minutes and you know, it can be rambly if you're uncomfortable and stressed out. And this is the part where that can be really challenging, because it's the first thing you're going to do in the interview. And so once you get past this, you kind of settle in, calm down a little bit, settle into the interview. But good to include, obviously, your name. You can reiterate your name. They obviously know your name. They may say your name, but you can repeat your name, your degree as it's relevant. And then what you're including in that 2 minutes maximum is a brief overview and summary of the things you're probably going to elaborate on during the interview. So you might give a little overview of your work experience, previous work experience, certifications, involvement, accomplishments that may be applicable. The things you want to avoid are really like personal information. It's not, you can give a little bit of information, maybe if you have like, well, if you have a family, you want to talk about your family, although we're going to talk a little bit about questions you do and don't have to answer, and information you don't have to share in an interview, such as marital status, whether or not you have kids, whether or not you plan to have kids. Those kinds of pieces of information are actually illegal for employers to ask about. And so if you choose to just kind of keep it really professional, you wouldn't include any personal information at all, just focused on your work experience and how you'd be an asset to that company. And then make sure you have a wrap up, a plan for like, here's my introduction. I'm going to wrap it up in a solid, wrap it up in a nice bow, and then practice it so that you've said it a few times through, so that by the time, and you've actually said it out loud. And I say this a lot with people preparing for interviews. If you don't have a lot of time, just talking to a mirror instead of, if you don't have time to practice with a person, because if you say things out loud, not just think them, the translation from your brain out your mouth is not always very consistent. So say it out loud, and then you'll feel a lot more confident when it's time to say it in the actual interview. Okay. All right, second big component in preparation for an interview is your research. You will guaranteed get some type of question where the company wants to know what you know about them or why you even want to work at their company. It might sound like, why did you apply for this job or at our company? Or what do you know about us? Very blunt and direct. And you want to make sure that you have some solid answers to that, and not just something that you could say about any company, but that shows you took at least 5 minutes. If you're right, you're short on time, but at least 5 minutes sifting through the website of the company and finding things like the mission and vision statements or the easy go-tos. Write down some notes, some thoughts about those items and how you feel like they align with your own mission and vision for yourself or your values. And then another great thing, like their website is what they want people to know about them. It's how they're promoting themselves to the world. So they should be talking about their accomplishments, what they've done, projects they have going on or coming up, changes that are going on in the company, all things that are great for you to know about and keep note of and ask questions about in the interview to show that you have really made that connection. Other ways you can do the research, look up their social media profiles. Again, these are ways that they're promoting themselves. So what they want folks to know, what are they putting out there? Are they in the news? You could do a Google News search or a Google alert for the company as well and get updates on what's being said about them that they didn't put out. And then if you have personal connections, use those. If you've worked there before or people who have worked there before, interview those people and find out a little bit about what they think of the company. And then bring that back to the, answer the question. Obviously positive, right? If you're hearing negative things, don't talk about that. But use that in maybe your decision making. But you can use personal connection and knowledge as well to be able to answer that. All right. And Hannah, I assume you're monitoring questions. Okay, I'm gonna make sure if anyone has questions, we're getting answered. Feel free also to just bring up questions as I'm talking or throw them in the chat. All right, so the big part of the interview process is that main chunk of time, right? You've got the introduction in the beginning, how you'll wrap up the interview, but the most of the time is spent getting information from you as the candidate, learning about what you've done before. And so often that's going to come across in behavioral style questions. And behavioral style or behavioral based questions are the most common way that an employer will interview people. And what they are questions that are designed to learn about what you have done in the past so that the employer can kind of picture you doing those things at their company in the future. If they were to hire you, they want to know, how have you been through these scenarios before? What have you done? And so what you want to do as an interviewer is come prepared with some stories that are fresh in your mind about scenarios you've encountered, skills you've used, because if you've thought about them ahead of time and you've practiced them and you've said them out loud, they'll be fresh on your mind and easy to kind of pull out of your head versus just thinking, and some people are really good at this. I am not. When I get nervous, and I'm asked a question and I haven't had time, I'm an internal processor. But if I haven't had time to think about it beforehand and kind of process, I just forget everything I've ever done. Like you may forget, like, no, I've never had a conflict in my entire life, or I can't recall one right now. So you can prepare those stories based off the job description. That's a good tool to use to know what kinds of things you might want to share. If the job description is stating certain requirements, you can probably bet they're going to ask you questions that have to do with those types of requirements, skills they're seeking in their applicants. So maybe they're looking for people who have like communication skills, verbal and written communication skills are very important. They may ask about your background with using good communication or having a bad experience with communication. Are there stories from school, from work, from volunteerism that you want to talk about in the interview? Bring those stories to the forefront of your mind, jot down some notes and keywords so they're fresh on your mind, and have them ready. So we like to say 10 to 15 power stories, 10, I would think maybe max, because sometimes you can use a story to answer a couple different questions, depending on the part of the story you're focusing on. And then, so the situation plus action equals results formula is one that I like to have people kind of think about as they're telling their story, because it can organize your thoughts a little bit while you're telling the story, because there's 3 things you really want to focus on when you're giving your answer. And that is, okay, I have the story in my head. I know what I want to say. First, I need to start with the situation. What did I do? What was the context of what was happening at the time? So they can kind of picture you in that scenario. And that this is where like details are really great. Be specific. Name the class you were in. Obviously, like name the position, the company you were working for, so they know the context of the situation you were in. Talk about the details of the situation, maybe the assignment you were working on, the project, what was the goal, the type of customer you were working with at the time. Be specific, because those details are really what make you stand out amongst the maybe 20 applicants they're going to interview over the next couple days. And then the second part of that equation, the action, that's the important part. That's what you did. So given the situation, state your specific actions. These are the skills I used. This is the action I took. This is the person I reached out to. This is the direct communication I had. Be specific about what you did. That's where they're going to start picturing you at their company, in their job, handling the same situation. How would you do it? And then the result. So based on your actions, what happened? How did the situation resolve itself? Nobody likes to hear a story that doesn't have an ending, right? You're like, what happened? You have to, tell them what happened. What was there a successful grade for the project? Was the customer complaint resolved? Did something change in the workplace because of actions you took? Things, you can tell the result, you can be quantifiable with that. So if there's some sort of like numbers to share, sales goals met, things like that, you can quantify it. But the result is particularly helpful too, because it helps you know that you're done. You've rounded out the answer and you know how to kind of wrap it up and end the way you're answering. Now, you may get behavioral style questions that are very obvious. Like, I think I have an example. Tell me about a time you used critical thinking skills to solve a problem. And so that's specific. They're saying, give me an example. Tell me about a story, or tell me a story of a time this happened. But sometimes, going back to this slide, strengths and weaknesses. What are your top 3 strengths? Everyone hates these questions. What are your strengths? And especially, what are your weaknesses? But even though they're not coming out as behavioral style questions, they don't sound that way. They are still great opportunities to tell a story versus just naming strengths. It's always best to give specific examples when possible, because anyone can come into the interview and say, my top 3 strengths are teamwork, communication, and time management. But the employer is not going to that's not going to stand out to them unless they have like a story that really, those details of the story connect them with you as the applicant. So tell a story that highlights them. Weaknesses. I talked a little bit about this before. That's one of the times you may be asked to talk about something negative. People get uncomfortable with this type of question in an interview as well, because you don't want to focus on negative things and you don't want to tell people what you've done poorly. I would have practiced with the question, tell me about a time you failed. And when focusing on those things, what the most important thing is that's where that genuine, authentic self comes through. You want to make sure you're being honest and genuine. And what they're looking for, not so much is to see like you squirm and be nervous about having failed, but that you're honest with the fact that you're not perfect, right? And you will make mistakes and on the job that you are interviewing for, and they want to know when you do, what are you going to do about it? So it's much more about a strong follow-up. And with weaknesses, we all have areas that we could be better at, that we could improve. We should always have areas we want to improve. We're never going to be finished developing as professionals. And so they want to know about your self-awareness and what those things are right now. So be honest and say, this is what I'd like to improve upon, and here's how I'm working to do that. All right. So questions about behavioral based or sharing your stories. Okay. All right, so I'm gonna move into my 4th item, which is questions. Now, this is the point of the interview where you're interviewing the company. They will always give you an opportunity, hopefully, they should give you an opportunity to ask questions of them. And this is where it turns now where you're the interviewer. You absolutely want to make sure you have questions prepared and ready to ask them. In worst case scenario, all of your questions get answered throughout the interview and you don't have any more and you can't think of any more. Then be honest and tell them, I had several questions, but you've already answered them. But it's best to have like up to 10 questions prepared ahead of time so that you're not left with no questions left to ask. Because having questions ready shows them that you've done your research, you've thought things through, you're really serious about the job because you have a lot of inquiry about, what it will really be like. This may be your only chance to really get from the horse's mouth, like what the realities of the job and the company will be. So take that opportunity to learn. Tailor the questions to the audience that you're speaking to. You may be in a meeting with the HR rep for the company or an HR hiring manager. They may have a different understanding of the position than a person who is like actually overseeing the role. If this person will be your boss, if you get this job, that's going to be a very specific set of questions that you're probably going to want to have ready to ask. You may want to ask about this person's leadership style, how they manage conflict, how they acknowledge their employees in good or bad situations, things that you know are needed for yourself to be effective in a job from a leader. You can ask that of the person that will be your boss and get that information. And then it's okay to take notes, because as you're sitting in a job interview or an interview of any kind, the people asking you questions are probably going to be taking notes about what you're saying. When it comes time for you to ask questions, you can absolutely have those questions typed up, written down, open up a notebook, make sure you're reviewing your questions, you don't forget any of them, and then take notes from what they're saying. Because if you have to go back once the job offer comes your way and determine whether or not you're going to take that job, you could review those questions and those notes and see what helps make that pro and cons list for you. All right, so things to have prepared. And then of course, the fifth thing, this is my general for almost anything, is just be prepared in general in terms of practice for the first four things we already talked about: that introduction, your research of the company, telling your stories, and having your questions ready. But then also prepare yourself ahead of time for your professional appearance. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that later on. Items to think about ahead of time of a job interview. In-person versus virtual job interviews, there's a little bit of difference in consideration, but you're still putting forth a professional presence. If you're going in person, you obviously, like, your outfit will be a little bit more, you have to think about that a little bit more. On a Zoom call, they can't really tell if your clothes are too wrinkled or, or dirty or something like that. But if you're going in person, you want to make sure you've pulled your outfit out of the closet at least a few days in advance. Make sure it's clean, make sure it's ironed, make sure it still fits, and have that ready so you're not scrambling at the last minute. And then when you arrive for an interview in person, no more than 10 minutes. Gets a little bit awkward if you're there too early, but you do want to show up a little bit early so that you can jump right into the interview as planned. Virtually, I think it's always good to sign on 5 minutes early, give it a little bit of buffer time, right? And that may include then the preparation of making sure you know where you're going. I like to do a trial run of the drive to the location before I go to a job interview, just to make sure I don't have any surprises on the way there. I'm not surprised by the parking situation, which could end up taking me extra time to get ready to be at the meeting. So, and virtually too, make sure your technology is ready. I know I've been ready to sign on to some Zoom interviews before and realized I wasn't logged in, or I didn't have my login actually like updated to a person. It was like from a previous work. And then I was panicking at the last minute, like, oh my gosh, I need to get this set up like now. So make sure that you've tested your tech. And if you're in person, you've done maybe like a trial run, or at least like really studied that Google map, right? All right. So that's my interview prep part. And then I'm going to hand it over to Emily.
I'm back. Thank you so much, Kate. I think you've actually really done most of my work for me. As you're thinking about the structural components and kind of the ways to be prepared for an interview, it's there, right? And disability adds potentially a layer and a context that you might evaluate this idea of does it need to impact your introduction? Do you want it to impact your introduction? As you're thinking about researching companies, is that a layer that you want to add into your research when you're thinking about the stories that you're telling, and so on and so forth? So this is just another layer of context, but I wanted to start by just talking about some basics and really just going all the way down to the level basic of Americans with Disabilities Act. At its core, the ADA is a piece of non-discrimination legislation. It helps us understand that we can't discriminate on the basis of disability, and thus it compels us to ensure that we're providing equal access when the request is made. There's actually different titles of the ADA. There's 5 titles. I'm only highlighting the first 3 because it's relevant to our conversation today. So Title I of the ADA covers employment, and that's really all phases of employment. So from hire to retire is kind of how we think about it in the employment world. So when we're thinking about disability and accommodations in an employment context, that really does cover a person through the stages of candidacy, and then through the employment experience, and then you know, if they leave the company, then that, you know, the employer would, of course, step away from that obligation. Title II and Title III cover public entities and places of public accommodation. And so the reason I bring this up is to provide assurances to this audience that indeed accommodations are available in an employment setting. Sometimes we hear people talk about kind of what happens, and this is just me switching hats, right? I'm putting on my post-secondary provider hat when I worked in disability resources. Sometimes we would have conversations about, well, okay, right, but what do accommodations look like in the employment setting? Like, that's not going to be available. And you know what, maybe there's not a one-to-one correlation between what happens in a post-secondary setting versus what happens in an employment setting. But I just want to level set that the obligation is there, right? Employers are certainly subject to complying with the ADA. And absolutely, this is kind of what my work encompasses, is looking at disability accessibility through the lens of employment, all the way from thinking about how to create experiences and programs and structures that are accessible from the outset to the greatest extent possible, all the way to engaging in the interactive one-to-one process to think about what accommodations might reasonably mitigate a disability-related barrier in the employment setting. So regardless of the ADA setting that we're navigating, I just also want to reiterate and level set that self-advocacy skills apply. So in the post-secondary setting, we're thinking about how do we know when an accommodation is required, right? And so the same thing, the same analysis and thought needs to be applied in the employment setting as well. So really understanding, I think an important part of disability disclosure in the employment context is really understanding if and how disability barriers show up for you in different settings and what access looks like in those different settings. And undeniably, there will be differences between the post-secondary world and the employment world. So really taking some time now to think and meditate on what is the barrier that may present and what might that look like. That doesn't mean that you need to have all the answers, but it's important to start thinking about those things because it will be the foundation for which you will begin the conversation about disability access in the employment setting. Okay, so another popular question that comes across my desk is this: what accommodations are available on the job? The answer is it depends. There's really no set answer. I'm sure that's not a shock or a surprise to anyone listening to this information today. The answer is often it depends. And that's the beauty of the ADA. It compels us to engage in an interactive process where we're thinking about the individual circumstances that an employee experiences. We're thinking about what's the environment where the employee is working and what are the accommodations that would potentially reduce or mitigate those disability related barriers. And until we have those facts, we really just can't say that, here are your 5 accommodations. I hope one of them works. Best of luck. That's really not where we're engaging in that conversation. We're still going through that individualized assessment. And so as an employer, if an employee comes to me and says, hey, I require an accommodation, the first thing that I want to do is I want to engage with the employee. I want to understand what are the disability related barriers that are showing up for them in their work environment. That's the first and most important thing I want to know. Another thing that I want to know are what are the essential duties of the job, right? Like, what are the things that you must do? These are the widgets that you were hired to produce, or these are the things that you were hired to do. It's kind of what's essential to that body of work that you're performing. This is where it's helpful, and as I'm thinking and encouraging you all to think about what does disability access look like for you. Something that's very helpful for me as a practitioner is to understand what accommodation solutions may reduce or eliminate barriers while preserving those essential elements. So that one's tricky, right? There's a balance between understanding that the person who experiences a disability has lived experience and just they're the expert, right, on their own disability barriers and kind of what access looks like for them. So the degree to which you're able to speak to that, to say, listen, for me previously, access has looked like X, Y, or Z. And it may not be a one-to-one correlation. I don't want you to be fearful of that. I don't want you to think to yourself, well, I've never had or used an accommodation in the job, so I don't necessarily know. I think even speaking historically to say, you know what, in other walks of life, this is what an accommodation has been for me, or this is what access has looked like for me. We can figure out, does that translate to an employment context? Perhaps, perhaps not, but that's a wonderful starting point for a conversation. You may not, and you know what, the other thing that I'm cognizant of is that some folks may have a disability condition, but they may not have encountered barriers, right? It's really environmental. It's really important to understand that a barrier may show up because the environment is new and you may not have experience. That's okay too. We spend a lot of time just talking with folks about, hey, this is new for me. You know, I have a new diagnosis. Something changed in my work environment, where I used to work in building A and it didn't have any accessibility barriers, and now I'm in building B and there's these other things that are coming up that are new and unknown to me. So it's okay if you don't have that background as well. So that's why I lean on folks a little bit to think about, what does access look like? And it's also bearing in mind with, a little bit of a qualifier that it's okay to say that you don't know. That's really what the employer is there to do, is to engage you in that interactive process and to help gather information that will kind of pull the whole picture together. And then depending on the circumstances, employers may require supporting documentation of a medical condition. So again, when you get into that employment setting and you're having those conversations about barriers and access requirements, your employer is going to walk you through any type of documentation or substantiation of the barriers related to your condition. I just want to put that out there. It will be highly situational. It will depend on the barriers experienced by the individual. It will depend on the employer and how they navigate disability access requirements. But I just want to kind of level set that might be part of the story as well. So, gosh, I again wish I could give a good answer, but in terms of what happens on the job, it depends. It depends on the barriers presenting. It depends on the essential requirements of the job, and what would reasonably mitigate that. Okay, that being said, let me just talk you through some things that I've seen happen. Again, we're case by case. But here are some things that I see more frequently: equipment or device accommodations. So things like adaptive technology, hardware or software, perhaps adaptive furniture or accessories. So perhaps I have a physical condition and it makes it difficult for me to sit at a desk or in my chair comfortably all day. I may be provided with a lumbar support to help with that. I might have perhaps a desk riser or a sit-stand station workstation. So those are things that we might see more frequently. Modified work schedules are something that comes up in the employment setting. So in some instances, we'll see employees that may need additional break time. They may need to adjust their start and end times. And so highly situational, but if I can color that in a little bit, perhaps I'm an employee that requires some different self-cares during the day. I might need some additional break time to engage in those self-cares. Start end time, perhaps I'm an employee that uses a particular medication that makes me groggy in the morning. And so if my employer can support it, perhaps instead of working from 8 to 4:30, I might work from 10 to 6:30, so long as the business needs can be met, right? Things like that. So those are kind of the schedule pieces. Interpreters, American Sign Language interpreters can be part of one's success or access equation at work. Accessible format materials. I'll say more about this. This could be providing things in alternative format, right? So if we have a print resource, are we providing it digitally in an accessible format? We're seeing a lot of conversation just broadly in the field, and likely no surprise. I think the same is true in a post-secondary world. We're talking a lot about digital accessibility. It's kind of the topic of our times, right? Digital accessibility is a thing. It's a thing in the post-secondary world. It's a thing in the employment world. And just thinking about how do we, in a digitally dependent society, how do we make sure that that content is equally accessible to people with disabilities? So I think that doesn't exactly translate one-to-one to accessible materials, but I think there's a connection there. Caption content, we see that coming up as an accommodation. Physical access, ensuring that our buildings have switches on the power switch doors. If we need an elevator, we need a way to get from one level to the next. How are we going to achieve that? And then I have a typo, my apologies, work location. I can say more about that. I left it pretty general, but I will say that even prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, there were instances of folks needing to work remotely for health reasons. COVID-19 has had a really interesting impact on our access landscape. In the employment setting, I think our bar is higher to prove that after doing work remotely for 2 years, how do we say, well, we did it remotely for 2 years, but not anymore. Now we need you to come back on site. And we're seeing some of that, right? Like that's a moment in time right now in the employment landscape as folks are shifting away from COVID response and saying, okay, come on, everyone, it's time to go back to the office. And we do have some folks that are saying, wait. Like I need to continue to work remotely, in some instances as a matter of disability access. And so then that's where we get into those essential requirements and that conversation of what is essential on site. And help me understand, if we were doing this remotely for a few years, what shifted that we can't continue in that model? Now, sometimes we do, right? Sometimes we found that there's kind of these workaround procedures that were in place during our COVID-19 response, and now we're reverting back to business as usual. And so it may or may not be reasonable, but work location is really an interesting topic, I think, in the employment setting, probably in the post-secondary setting too, right? Just like how do we shift from one world to the next, and what's the justification and rationale of why we could do it in one moment in time, and kind of how does that look different now? So anyway, very interesting topics for us to go into rabbit holes. But really, again, when we're thinking about potential accommodations, I'm going to go back to my central message. Articulating the barriers that present in the workplace will be critical to identifying an effective solution. Our level is the same, right? We need to understand what are the barriers that present in the workplace. What are the potential accommodation solutions that would reduce or eliminate those barriers while also preserving the essential duties of a particular job? Okay, things that are likely not a reasonable accommodation. Now listen, take this with a grain of salt, because I've been trained in the world of disability access to never say never. We're always going to engage in an interactive process. We are always going to review the facts. We're going to look at every single angle, upside down, sideways, you name it, we're going to examine it. But generally, things that would not be a reasonable accommodation would be things like creating a job, eliminating essential job duties. So if I was hired in a contact center to be answering customer phone calls, and that was the essential duty of the job, that's what I was hired to do. Having an accommodation that said, hey, Emily, you don't need to be on the phones, likely not going to be a reasonable accommodation. That's what I was hired to do. Reducing bona fide productivity requirements. So if the expectation is that you produce 10 widgets in a day, a reasonable accommodation is likely not going to be you're now required to produce 4 widgets in a day, right? We have these production requirements. Generally, we're going to hold to those that will not be found as a reasonable accommodation. Also, providing the best or most expensive accommodation. We're really not getting too tied up in the price tag of an accommodation. We're thinking about what effectively mitigates the barrier. So if I require, oh gosh, I'm struggling to think of an example. Let's say I require an adaptive accessory for my chair. I require a lumbar support. I'm going to find the support that effectively reduces the barrier. Whether that costs $10 or $100. I'm looking for the tool that effectively does that. And so if I provide you as an accommodation to say, hey, this $10 device does the same thing, we might not be able to say it's reasonable. No, I require the $100 one, right? We're thinking about what's the barrier that's being eliminated by the tool being offered. Okay, let's talk about disclosure in the workplace. I think this is the question of the times. And I get lots of questions. I've heard lots of questions over the years. When's the right time to disclose a disability? And the truth is, disclosure can happen at any time. There's really not a right or wrong time to disclose one's disability. And I think from an employer perspective, we're understanding of that, right? We understand that disclosure is an intensely personal decision. It's an intensely personal decision. And so a person may talk about disability early on in their employment experience. They may talk about it much later on. And as an employer, it's really not our job to do any type of postmortem on why you tried to, why you disclosed and when. It's really more of, okay, these are the facts that are presented. Let's go ahead and begin that interactive process so we can find the solutions that are necessary in this employment context. I think also the thing to be aware of is that through our lifetime, we're simply through the aging process, we're perhaps more likely to acquire a disability condition, right? As we age, our body changes, our vision changes, our hearing changes. And so disclosure may not be something that we have, on day one of employment. It might be a situation that we come into. It could be situational, it could be temporary, it could be long-term. And we don't know what levers are being pulled on in a person's life. So we really don't generally get too hung up in, is there a right or wrong time to disclose? We're really simply taking the ball that you give us and moving it forward when you feel the time is right. I would say, the other question that comes up often is like, but when is the right time to disclose, right? Like, when should I do it? In fact, just recently, a question came across the desk of someone on my team saying, hey, should I disclose now or later? And the truth, the answer was kind of squishy. It was a little bit of, well, really, that's up to you. We're really, as an employer, we're not mandating that you disclose during the candidacy phase or during the offer phase or the post-offer phase or anything like that. So I guess, again, it comes back to that self-advocacy and really taking time now to think about what is your story and how does disability and disability-related barriers fit into that story. I guess the piece of advice that I would offer is, if the barrier that presents limits my ability to demonstrate my capacity in the job or my subject matter expertise in an area, or to perform the work that I was hired, for me personally, that might be a flag to say, this is the time where I need to begin a conversation about accommodations, because this barrier, this environmental barrier, is interfering with my capacity to do the work that I was hired to do. That may not be the right solution for you. That's one framework that I want you all to be thinking about, is if there's an intersection of barrier and job performance or job duties or demonstrating subject matter expertise, that might be a flag to say, okay, this is the point where we have to have a conversation about this. Again, being aware that self-awareness is critical, and then just continually assessing whether or not these barriers are presenting in the employment setting. Employment settings change all the way from a physical setting. We saw that, right? We in our COVID moment, we were on site and then we were working remotely, and now we're sometimes somewhere in the middle, or it depends. The other thing to think about is kind of sometimes jobs, like the nature of the work, shifts over time. We've seen that with technology, and as technology continues to grow and emerge, sometimes we would have a physical process that might be supplemented with technology. So is that part of the story? So continuing to assess the environment, on and on and on. Okay, so disclosure strategies, I think I've talked about this a little bit, and I think Kate really laid a nice foundation, is thinking about stories, right? And so what is your story, and how would you know when it's time to share your story? So a few things to be thinking about is whether or not one's disability is obvious. And if so, does that need to be addressed in the employment process? We know, just like statistically speaking, that the majority of disabilities experienced by individuals are non-apparent or invisible disabilities. So in many instances, folks may not know that a person experiences a disability, or that's part of your story. In other instances, if I go to, for example, an interview and I have a sign language interpreter with me, that disclosure moment has happened, right? And so then it's thinking about if and when do I bring that up during the interview process. Highly situational, and something for you all to be thinking about. One thing, in terms of when and if you choose to have that disclosure moment and talk about accommodations, I would encourage you to keep the conversation focused on barriers that are presenting in the work environment versus offering specific diagnostic details. I think from an employer perspective, we may not know what does it mean to have a particular mental health condition. I may not know what that looks like for you, but you know what I understand is I can understand that, I have a medical condition. Part of my treatment plan results in me being very groggy in the morning. And so the timeline for this, these standard working hours, is there a possibility to explore that through the lens of reasonable accommodation, right? So thinking about the barriers that are presented. If you're able to, I touched on this before, being prepared to provide details on potential effective solutions when possible. So in other words, another way to think about that is, what does access look like for you? And again, you don't necessarily have to have the answers going into that conversation, but just having examples of what has been effective in the past can sometimes give us a nice little breadcrumb trail to figure out how are we going to navigate this within the employment setting. Something else that I would encourage, and this is a story that stuck with me all these years down the road, probably a good solid 10 years in the making. Years ago, I was talking with a student about how do you disclose disability? And we were talking about the strengths and weaknesses part of the interview process. And I'll never forget, the student said to me, do I bring this up in the weaknesses? And I'm telling you, I about tipped over out of my chair because my heart broke. But that, right. And so let's be very intentional. We do not want to think about disability as a weakness. We want to think about disability in the context of access. We want to think about this in capacity to demonstrate productivity, to ensure that your productivity is where you want it to be. We want to think about this as tools to engage in work. And earlier, Kate was talking about kind of being able to assess what is a good fit for me as the candidate, as the potential employee. How would I know? And I think this is important, right? If you ever have an opportunity to ask questions, perhaps not questions specific to what does disability access look like in this employment setting, perhaps that's a question you want to ask, perhaps not. If that felt like that weren't a question that you'd want to ask for any particular reason, if you felt like, oh, this may create a disclosure and I'm not ready for that yet, something else that you could think about is, asking if you're interviewing with the person who would be your manager, thinking about a question like, what does it look like for you as a manager to support your employees? Like, as a manager, how do you provide support to your employees? That can be a little bit telling of how do they think about the person? Is this a holistic experience? Is this like, hey, I just want you to drive for results? Maybe that resonates with you, right? But I just want to be very intentional to ensure that as you're thinking about disclosure, maintaining that context of, this is what access looks like for me. Here's the tools that I need to demonstrate my subject matter expertise. These are the tools that will facilitate my ability to drive for results, whatever that looks like in your respective fields. Think about applying the disability disclosure moment within those pieces of framework. It just, like I said, all these years later, this story has stuck with me about a student who thought about, do I frame this from the lens of weakness? And I cannot be clear enough that employers really are thinking about these as tools. What are the tools that you need to get your work done? Other disclosure tips, again, I think Kate has done a nice job of teeing this up for me, but practice disclosure, practice it with someone from the Center for Equal Access, someone from Career Services, a trusted friend or loved one. You can have all the words in your head, and when it gets to that moment of disclosure or conversation where it's actually flowing out from you, it may not always go one-to-one. And I will just share a fun story with this group. You know, I had to queue up a conversation, and I actually wrote the notes down and I practiced with somebody. And even then, when I actually delivered the message, it still didn't come out as planned. So I would say if you can practice more than once, that would be even better. We talked a little bit about researching. Does the company's website perhaps frame how they might consider disability? Do they consider it through the compliance lens? Do they consider it as part of bringing one's authentic self to the work environment? That can be a little bit telling as well, just in terms of how an employer might be thinking about disability. And then understand the process. If and when you get to that disclosure point, make sure that you're clear on what are the steps to be followed to request and implement an accommodation in the workplace. So if you get to that disclosure moment, if you decide that's right for you, just making sure that you're tracking the steps and you're seeing it through from end to end if that's what's right for you. I will also say, much like the post-secondary setting and the employment setting, we do have informational conversations, right? So it's just an inquiry. Someone wants to know, is a particular accommodation available? Does the process exist? That is totally fine. As an employer, we're not going to require a person to implement an accommodation. So if you simply want to gather facts and then further assess if moving forward is the right thing for you, that is totally natural. That happens. And that's part of the process as well. That could be helpful for you. I think that is it. I think I hand it back over to Kate. That's the disability piece. Do I need to pause for questions though before we do that?
There are.
Yay. All right, Kate, I pass the floor back to you.
And I'm just going to jump back into a few items again of preparation. I mentioned before, planning your professional presence. And this is, of course, like really focused on in-person interview experiences. But the same thing with Zoom or virtual interviews. You want to try to just basically keep things really simple, because the main thing that you want to stand out and be memorable is you and the things you have to say, and not a distraction of things like, you know, crazy hair or really bright, loud, big pieces of jewelry, things like that, things that are like really great for kind of expressing ourselves, but can be a little distracting sometimes. But also like for your own comfort level too. I know that if I'm wearing certain things or my hair is in a way that distracts me because I'm thinking about it too much or I'm messing with it too much, then it's harder for me to focus on what I'm trying to do. And also your professional presence, not just coming across in the way you look, but in the way that you communicate. And so nonverbal communication makes up for the majority of the things that the way we communicate and what comes across. So keeping in mind eye contact, engagement through facial expressions, how it is that this is why I always I recommend practice with someone or with yourself in a mirror, or even like record yourself on your phone giving an interview answer and then watch it back as if you're an athlete reviewing tape. Because we don't know what we look like to other people. We do more so now in this Zoom world we live in, because we're always watching ourselves talk. But just kind of getting a sense of like, what are your facial expressions telling somebody, and making sure that your nonverbal communication is positive and enthusiastic. And then again, positivity, making sure your presence is coming across as a positive. You want to be a positive component of the environment you're working in, because I'm sure we've all had experiences of working with people that really dwell on negative or problems and not solutions. And so it's a good thing to keep in mind.
We do have a question.
Yeah, question.
So it's for Emily. Regarding invisible disabilities, is it better to disclose during interview process? Or during the job, but would the company get mad if I do not disclose until after I start the job?
Okay, so the question is around if a person experiences an invisible disability, is it better to disclose during the interview process or after starting on the job? And would the company be upset if that disclosure didn't happen, for example, in the interview phase, right? Am I capturing that correctly? Okay, good. All right. I guess the answer is it depends, which I know is the worst answer in the world, but let me color that in a little bit. Let me try to offer some more words to help color that in and perhaps make sense of it. If it were me as a candidate, one thing I would really be seeking to understand is, number one, how does that invisible disability show up for me in my day-to-day experiences, right? Whether it's in the post-secondary setting, any current employment that you're experiencing right now, just in your daily life, right? So that's the first thing that I want to be able to get my finger on the pulse of, is how does this show up in my day-to-day life? As I'm going through the interview process, I'm wanting to understand more about what are the essential requirements of the job. So what are the things that I'm going to be asked to do every single day, right? Where am I expected to go for my job? Do I report to an office? Am I working in a hybrid setting? Am I working remotely? So I want to be just assessing as many components of the environment as possible, all the way from job duties to where does the work actually happen. I would want to understand more about what does success look like on the job. So like if I get hired to do a job, how are you going to know that I'm doing a good job? What are the components that are going to measure this? Is it because I answer 20 phone calls a day? Is it because I complete 5 items on my project backlog? Like what are those metrics for performance? So I'm going to be wanting to gather as much of that information as possible. Now, to be very transparent, you may not know that. You may not be able to drill down to that level of specificity during the interview process. And that's okay. From an employer perspective, there's really not a sense of anyone being mad because disclosure didn't happen in the candidacy phase versus the employee phase. There is a good amount of respect that is given to what an individual brings into that disclosure moment. So it may feel comfortable to start a conversation about what, I may have some disability access requirements, and talking about that during the candidacy phase. If that feels like the right time to share your story, then that's what I want you to do. I want you to say, I have some disability access requirements. Who do I talk to about that? Or all the way to, I know for me, one of the essential tools for success is having access to a screen magnifier. Tell me what that looks like at company X, Y, or Z, right? So if you have a real good sense of what access looks like and it feels comfortable for you to talk about it during the candidacy phase, go for it. If it doesn't feel comfortable, right? Like let's say your first concern is I want to secure this job, and then talk about implementing reasonable accommodations, then we're going to kick off that interactive process that I talked about, where we're understanding what are the barriers that are presenting and what are the essential job requirements that we need to hold firm to, and then what are the solutions that we can put in place that would mitigate those barriers. So I really wish I could say, you know what, do it as a candidate or do it once you're hired as an employee. I think the devil's in the details, and there's so much that gets into the weeds of things, all the way from what are your access requirements to what are the essential duties of the job, that it's really hard to pin down a precise answer. So again, these are the things that I want you to be thinking about is what can you understand about the environment in which you'll be working? What do you understand about access requirements? And then is that something that you as a candidate, right? Because remember, Kate talked about this is you interviewing the company as much as the company is interviewing you. So as a candidate, is that part of what you bring into that experience, that you, to feel comfortable and confident accepting a job with the company, you need to have a good sense of whether your accommodation will be met. Or is it more that you want to get your feet into the job, you want to understand the landscape and the environment, and then you'll feel ready to talk about accommodation. So I wish I could give a better answer. I really wish I could pin it down to do X or Y. It's just terribly muddy. I would say lean on your resources in that moment, right? If you have an opportunity to talk with your career services, if you have an opportunity to talk with your Center for Equal Access, and just do some role playing about what this might look like in different settings. There's a few resource slides at the end as well. I would just point you in the direction of a couple job accommodation network, Disability In. You can find some really rich and helpful information there about disclosure moments and how to navigate some of those things as well. All right, I'm going to give it back to Kate.
That made me think of a question. For CEA, do you work with students after they graduate?
It depends.
Okay.
I mean, we're happy to, but there isn't a I mean, it really has all depended.
Okay, so the answer is it depends. Maybe a case by case basis that even after you graduate and you're going through a job search process, you may be able to reach out to CEA, your contact there. With career services, we work with students up to 3 years post-graduation on any of the services we provide. So that's always something to keep in mind as well. I wanted to just promote this resource that we have through career services, which is a really, really great opportunity for students to, if you need professional attire or just freshen your wardrobe or something, or things aren't fitting anymore and you need to update it. This clothing room in Tower 1127, it's open 8 to 4:30 Monday through Friday. You can just walk in anytime. There's no need to interact with our office if you don't want. But all the items in that room are donated by either Maurice's or faculty and staff, and then they're sorted and cleaned and made sure they're pressed and are in good condition by student government. But they're free for students to take. So if you like something and it fits you well and you want to use it for interviews, we have, presentations, whatever you might need a nice outfit for, go ahead and take it. But students can also just borrow things and bring them back too, if they know that they don't need to keep a hold of it. And then just a couple things to end here with consideration in terms of things to actually bring with you. Now, again, I'm thinking of physical in-person interviews. It is perfectly acceptable and normal to bring extra resume copies of what you'd sent for the job. They may already have your resume. They should. I mean, you applied with it, but sometimes people come to the meeting unprepared, or they just didn't get a chance to print it or something. So you can always have extra copies. A notebook, I mentioned this before, having notes for yourself prepared ahead of time so you can make sure that you don't forget anything or forget your questions. So a Padfolio or a nice folder or notebook, something to write with so you can take notes. A nice bag that isn't too big, because you don't want to have to worry about hauling things around, especially you never know if your interview will involve touring or just having to move around. You don't want to have to carry a lot of things in your hands. And then you can have a water or snack with you. Typically they offer a beverage to an interviewee. And I always recommend having a snack in a bag just in case you're in a really long interview. And so for instance, a half day or even a full day, I've been through a full 8-hour day interview. And I had snacks in my bag because I didn't get a chance to eat at the meals that were provided because I was too nervous and I was talking to the people who were interviewing me. So I would eat snacks when I had restroom breaks. So something to think about. On the other side of that, some things to consider not bringing. Cell phone. Now, that is more so a distraction reason. It's 2023. We're all pretty dependent on our smartphones for a lot of different reasons. It may even be something that's needed as for an accessibility thing for you with a disability. But I have it on there to really as if it's going to be a distraction for you, because even when we have our phones on silent, we still think about it in a, like, I know I do in a group setting where my phone's on silent. I still like my mind will be drawn to whether or not, wondering whether or not my phone will actually make a sound somehow, or, you know, when there's like a, Amber Alert and then all the phones go off regardless if they're on silent. So if it's going to be on your mind, then just leave it in your car or leave it at home. Excess clothing or layers, again, if you can like keep it simple and just have like a heavy blazer or a sweater instead of having to, this is hard in the winter, in the Minnesota winters, because we all have winter gear, but trying to just keep it as simple as possible. Again, in oversized bags, just extra things you have to carry. And then the last two things make me kind of laugh, but I did literally see them on, I was doing some research, and they are, I know them for them to be, especially the parents one. I don't know if I've ever actually experienced someone bringing like a full meal with them. Don't do that. And your parents or anyone else did the interview with you, unless it's, you know, an interpreter or something. All right, and then just a few follow-up items. So it's really good to make sure it's a great practice to send a thank you or an email. Follow-up emails are perfectly acceptable. It used to be that we would teach like send a thank you note, handwrite it. You can certainly still handwrite a thank you note if you know you have time to get it mailed and sent. But emails are just becoming very acceptable because they're easy and they're easy to share with a full committee. But thank them for their time, reiterate your excitement for the position, mention something specific that you learned in the interview that excites you. It's just a great way to make yourself stand out amongst candidates, and then stay in contact too. So keep a record, like keep note to yourself of when you interviewed and when you've been in contact, because the hiring processes vary in speed, and things can happen that slow down a process. And so just because you're not hearing for a while doesn't mean that you didn't get the job. But you can check back in with them and just say, I interviewed a couple weeks ago. I just wanted to check on the status. It's also really helpful before you leave the interview to get a timeline of when you can expect to hear back, or like what the next steps are. That's a great question to ask. I highly recommend at least getting that question in. When can I expect to hear back? Because then you can plan when maybe a follow-up could be. Right, and so these are the resources. I don't know if you wanted to talk about them at all, or we'll definitely share this presentation because these are linked, I believe. The different resources that hopefully you want to talk about some of the specific ones.
Yeah, I can. So I think this is number one. I know this is just a rich amount of resources. I can say from the employer side, the resources that I'm looking at really often are Disability In, which I mentioned. What I like about Disability In is it has a lot of the new and emerging best practices. So that's a really cool opportunity if you want to kind of put your finger on the pulse of what does emerging access trends, what are emerging access trends. So one thing you'll see is, you know, companies, I think more and more, I would like to think, are shifting from a compliance mindset around ADA and disability accommodations into more of that, let's empower employees to have tools to do the work that they were hired to do. So I think you'll get a nice sense of that through Disability In. There's lots of different ways that you can measure that through Disability. And so you'll see that Disability In has a lot of things in there around digital accessibility, which I mentioned. We're also talking about accessible procurement, which is buying goods, services, and products that are accessible from the outset. So I think, you know, that's a good place to get a sense of what disability access could look like if a company is more compliance focused at this point. And compliance is better than nothing. So let's think about that very, very carefully, but that's what I like Disability In for. I already mentioned too the job accommodation network. I use that. There's different personas on the job accommodation network. I find myself more frequently using the employer persona, right? Because that's the role that I'm in right now. But the job accommodation network does have a good robust amount of resources out there for employees with disabilities. So I think that's a really helpful tool if you're thinking about disclosure. And how do you navigate those disclosure conversations? If you're thinking about, hey, I'm running into some sort of barrier. I don't know exactly what the solution looks like, but let me pop out to the Job Accommodation Network and just start to, do some searching and see what are some potential solutions out there. So that's why I use Job Accommodation Network, is to make sure that as I'm thinking about accommodation requests and I'm doing some analysis of something that's new or something that I don't have a lot of experience with, I'm going out to the Job Accommodation Network so I can make sure, like, oh, what are the possibilities? Have I looked at this, upside down and sideways and inside out, and like, am I exhausting the full range of potential possibilities there? So those are two that I would call out that I've found very helpful, but of course I think all of them are rich sources of information for folks to avail themselves of. I don't know, Hannah, do you have any that you love the most?
I can just talk about so the last one on this slide, specifically this disclosure process, is a worksheet that was actually developed by a couple disability Minnesota voc rehab people, where it's kind of a worksheet to help you think about how to disclose. It has some questions, has a way for you to kind of develop, that language that both Emily and Kate talked about of, what that should look like, how that would look, and practicing it. So it gives you some kind of more in-depth kind of questions to ponder and think about when it comes to disclosing a diagnosis or disability at the workplace, and can help kind of think through also that when question. So that one's there available. It is a Google Doc, so if you are going to use it, I would encourage you to make a copy. Otherwise it's going to, you'll be editing the master version. And other people that go into it may be able to see your things. So just keep that in mind. And then the last one is, these are really job search tools that can help you find jobs that are looking for diverse employees, where this may help and make you feel comfortable in applying for that job with a disability, knowing that these companies are specifically looking to diversify their employment or employees. We'll turn it back over to Kate.
Just because I always like to share in presentations with things we have upcoming that Career Services is sort of connected with. We're not hosting either of these, but we do. Our students at CSS are welcome to join these two events. And so if you're an education student, the education job fair is March 30th, and you've likely heard about it from your department. But the University of Wisconsin Superior Job Fair also this Thursday, March 30th. You can find out about both of these two in Handshake, and we will have a van running over to Superior on Thursday. So if you have any questions about that, let me know. And here's my contact information, because we're at the end, our last slide, and we did go right up to the end of the time. And so if you have any further questions, feel free to throw them in the chat or go off mute and ask. But as I mentioned, this PowerPoint will be, I can send it out to the attendees, and we'll have the recording of the presentation as well available.
I see one more question in the chat, that last one there.
Okay. Very formal or informal disability friendly employers in Minnesota somewhere. Yeah, is that, Hannah, something you can answer in that?
Yeah, I guess.
Maybe it's.
Yeah. I'm not sure if that question came in before. Now I went over this slide, but like I said, these are a great place to start. I don't know of like a specific list for just Minnesota. But I know like these are what's recommended to kind of look for. And you can see some of them are specific to certain areas, like USA Jobs is looking for employment in the federal government. So I think it's worth kind of going through these and just seeing.
Can you do state filters?
I don't know. I guess I haven't really dug into. I would assume that you could. Get hired and inclusivity are pretty like they're national ones. So I would assume that you could narrow it down to kind of where you're looking. It would be kind of silly if you couldn't.
Yeah.
You know, you're looking to work in Minnesota, but all of them are just following up for California, you know, that'd be kind of silly. So I would assume that there should be features to narrow it down to where and what you're looking for too. Any questions? Okay. Any last minute questions? All right, well, I think on behalf of Emily and Kate, I will say thank you for attending. We will, like Kate said, get the recording out as well as the PowerPoints. The recording is just going to take a little bit of time to get out, but we can get you this PowerPoint out sooner than that. All right, thank you.
Stop first.
Yeah, I don't know how to stop the recording. There we go.
That's what I was looking for is the little recording. I think of when you're sharing your screen, you can't really see it.